Next, let's talk about sprite interaction and scoring. So often in a game, the whole point of a game, the whole fun of a game is that you have sprites that interact. You have a bullet sprite that you shoot that's supposed to hit a target, or you have two sprites that are clashing or fighting. So interaction is really what makes a game interesting. So first of all, how do you get multiple sprites to interact? How do you sense when one sprite hits another, for example? And then how do you use that event to trigger, say, something like a score change? Okay, so here's our plain old arrow sprite. Same blocks we built before for motion. So left arrow, when I press left arrow, it turns counterclockwise. When I press right arrow, it turns clockwise, and up arrow is forward. Okay, so our same block. Now notice I've added another sprite, this apple sprite here, kind of just placed randomly here. So let's take a look at a proof of concept. So say I want to build in some interaction. I want to say that if the arrow sprite hits the apple sprite, then I want a score variable to go up by 1. So hitting the apple with the arrow sprite is a score increase of 1, adds 1 to the score. Okay, so let's see how we do that. Okay, now first of all, I probably need to make a variable called score. So I go to my variable section, I'll click on make a variable, and I'll make a variable called score. Leave all those other things as defaults, click OK. And then we see the score variable appearing here. So now I can use this to access that variable. And I can see in my stage that I have the score display. Okay, now by the way, if you want to hide that, if you want to get rid of that score display, you can always use this hide variable. And then you can choose which variable, and that'll take care of that. That'll erase it from the stage. Now notice also I put on the stage, I put the coordinate axes, not because it's a nice game background, just because to get some reference to see where things are. So I got this apple sprite, so now I've got a score variable. So now let's see how we build an interaction. How do we tell when sprites collide, and how do we do an action based off of that? So I'm going to switch to the apple sprite and click on it here. Right now there's no scripts involved, so let's start building in some interactivity in the apple. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my control blocks, and I'm going to click my same old green flag button. So this is kind of like starting the game. So when I start the game, I want several things to happen. Well, actually, in this case, I only want one main thing to happen, and that is to reset the score to 0. So I'm going to use this set block. I'm going to set score to 0. Okay, so I want to reset the score every time I restart the game. Okay, now the apple is not going to move. It's not under the player's control, so I don't have to build in any movement into the apple control or apple sprite. It's just going to sit there. But what it's doing is it's waiting for the arrow sprite to hit it. So when the arrow sprite hits it, then we want some code to kick into action. We want an event handler there to sense that. Then when that's triggered, then we want the score to increase by 1. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my control block. So I'm going to look for an event handler. I don't see one necessarily that looks like it's going to sense if one sprite hits another, but I do have this guy right here. Okay, this when block, and then there's that hexagonal space there. That looks like it might have some promise. When I get hit by the arrow sprite, then increase the score by 1. Okay, so I got to look for something to fill in that hexagonal space. Okay, and it turns out that we go to the sensing area. Sensing is looking for different kinds of events taking place, and that's what we're doing. So I notice the first thing there is touching, and that's a hexagonal shape. So I can kind of snap that in there. So remember, I'm looking at it from the perspective of the apple sprite. So I want to sense if the apple sprite is touching, and I can click on the drop down. Notice there are several options. I want to see whether it's touching my main sprite, which is called Sprite. Okay, so when I'm touching the main sprite, what do I want to happen? Okay, well, what I want to happen is I want the score to increase by 1. So I go back to variables. Okay, I have this block, the change block. So I can say change the score by 1. Okay, we'll leave it at the default. So this is an event handler. So this should be waiting in the background. It'll sense when the arrow sprite touches the apple. And when it does, it'll change the score by 1. Okay, so let's check it out. So green flag. Okay, now I can move around. So I can forward my up arrow. Let me turn to face the arrow. and go forward, hit it. Okay, watch the score displays. Okay, see how it's going up? So it's sensing that I'm touching it and it's going up. Okay, now there's something a little bit funny about that though. Normally in a game, you don't want you don't want the score to be continually going up. Okay, notice that's already at 700. So what was happening was it's doing what you're telling it literally. I mean, it's every time it senses a touch from the sprite, and if the sprite is continuing to touch the apple, it'll sense all of those as touches. Okay, so when I'm touching the apple and I'm still touching it, still touching it, still touching it. So as long as I'm in contact with the apple, it's going to sense that as another touch, and that's why the score is kind of just going up and up and up because I'm still in contact with it. Those are all being registered as touches, and it's still going up and up and up and up and up. Okay, so I'm going to stop that because that's not quite what we want. Normally in a game, you just hit it once, just for each distinct hit, then that's going to be a score increase. Okay, as it is now, it's just sensing as long as I'm in contact with the apple, that's going to sense as another touch, and it's just continually sensing another touch, another touch. That's why it keeps going up. Okay, so this is a good illustration, and I wanted this to happen because this is a good illustration of debugging. So when you're making a program, especially something complex like a game, nothing ever works the way it should the first time you try it. There's always little bugs and things that you got to work out. So this is a good opportunity for us to talk about that. Okay, so debugging, well, it does something. It's doing exactly what you're telling it, but that's not quite what we meant. Okay, what we meant was we want only a single distinct touch to register as a score increase. If we're continuing to stay in contact with the apple, we don't want those to register as more separate touches and increase the score. We just want it one touch and then off. Okay, so we got to think about how we can build that in. Okay, so probably what we want to do is we want to, once it senses a touch, we want it to wait before checking for other touches until the sprite moves off of it. Okay, and that way it'll only sense each distinct touch. Okay, not continually if you're staying in contact with it. Okay, so once it senses a touch, we want the event handler to wait, to stop waiting for touches, to stop looking for touches until the arrow sprite moves off of the apple and it's not in contact anymore. And then if it comes back, then that's another touch. Okay, so we want to build in some kind of wait time. Once it senses a touch, we want it to wait for the arrow to move off of the apple before it starts looking for more touches. Okay, so now luckily there's some pretty nice functionality built into Snap. So if we go to our control blocks, okay, you'll notice that there's a block, if I scroll down a little bit, that says wait until. Okay, so this is kind of what we're looking for. We want to, once it senses a touch and changes the score, ups the score by 1, we want it to wait to start looking for other touches until the arrow moves off of it so it's no longer in contact. And then we can start waiting for more touches. Okay, so we want to wait until, well, what are we waiting until? We're waiting until the arrow is no longer in contact, is not touching the apple sprite. Okay, so how do we know how to sense if it is touching. Okay, that's the sensing block. That's this guy right here, this blue block. Okay, we know that. So this block will sense if it is touching. How do we sense if it's not touching? Okay, well, we can reverse it by, if we go to operators, okay, notice that there's this not block here, this green block here that says not. And that's how we can reverse a check. Okay, so if instead of checking for when it is touching, if we want to check when it's not touching, we can use that green not block to reverse it. So I can drag that, pop that in there. So now it's going to wait until it's not touching the arrow sprite before it starts to check for more touches. Okay, so this hopefully will fix that weird problem of the score just kind of going up and up and up and up and up and up. So let's try it. Okay, so green flag, that resets everything. Score is now back to 0. Okay, so let's go ahead and touch the apple again. So I'll move forward. I'll turn and face the apple and then go forward. Okay, so see I hit the stem. So it sensed that touch. Now see how I'm staying in touch with it. I'm still in contact with the apple. but this time the score is not going up. It's just staying there. Okay, because it's once it hits, since it's one touch, it's going to wait for the arrow sprite to move off of the apple before it tries to sense another one. So there I moved off of it. Okay, now if I go back and touch it again, it should sense that as a second touch. Okay, so let me turn around, go back, touch it. See how it jumped up now two, but it's not jumping up continually. It sensed that second touch, and now it's going to wait until it's not touching the apple again before it looks for a third touch. Okay, so that kind of helped us solve our problem there. Okay, so big idea from this segment is sprite interaction. So how do you sense when sprites are touching, and how do you kick into gear some action based off of that? Also, we talked about score. And then the idea, this last idea of debugging. So when you have code, oftentimes it's not going to do what you think it's going to do the first time. So you got to just kind of debug it and think about really what you're telling the computer to do. Okay, all right, so that's motion combined with sprite interaction and scoring and a little bit of debugging thrown in there.